Welcome to the Storytelling That Sticks for Business and Life podcast. I'm your keynote, TED Talk, and story coach, Doug Stevenson. In this podcast series, I'm going to share with you some simple and practical storytelling techniques and hacks that will make you stand out from the competition so that you can get paid to speak, or to give a TED Talk that goes viral, or to simply tell your story in a way that makes a difference in the world. You'll learn how to choose, craft, and deliver stories that stick. Personal stories from your amazing life, business stories, leadership and sales stories, stories that are marketable and memorable, stories that sell you and your product or service. My job as your virtual keynote and story coach is to help you design and deliver stories and speeches that get people to do what you want them to do, or to consider a new perspective. If you're serious about using storytelling to advance your career, to get paid to speak, or simply to get your message across in a more engaging and compelling manner, this podcast is for you. All right, well, let's get started.
Mark Sanborn gave his first public speech at the age of 10 in a 4-H club contest, and according to Mark, he did so poorly that it challenged him to try again. And if you know Mark Sanborn, as I've had the privilege of knowing him for the last 14 years, that tells you all you need to know about his drive and competitive spirit. While attending Ohio State University, Mark worked his way through college as an after-dinner speaker. After graduation, he was an account executive, regional manager, and associate publisher in the magazine publishing industry. He's been speaking professionally since 1977 and started speaking full-time in 1986. Mark has always been passionate about great leadership. In 1978, he was the national president of a 500,000-member youth organization, and most recently was president of the National Speakers Association. Mark is primarily a leadership speaker, and he has also spoken on customer service and remarkable performance. LeadershipGurus.net lists him as one of the top 15 leadership experts in the world today. He is an avid motorcyclist, skier, and scuba diver, and he and his wife Darla and sons Hunter and Jackson live in Denver, Colorado. Mark, I'm really interested in your signature story called The Fred Factor. Can you tell me a little bit about the story and how it became such an important part of your speaking career?
Sure. Well, as professional communicators, I think we always need to be looking for stories. But that doesn't necessarily mean just searching online and through books of anecdotes and illustrations, but paying attention to what happens in our lives. And certainly the Fred Factor was a simple case of me paying attention to an extraordinary service provider that I had when I moved to Denver and bought a house back in 1988. And Fred Shea, the real-life postal carrier, became at the time a customer service illustration for my work in public seminars, but later evolved to represent some broader and bigger themes than simply customer service.
Now, one of the things that I realized from listening to the Fred Factor story is the event itself was not some monumental event. It was a pretty simple thing in time. I mean, here's your mailman, and you kind of observed the way he interacted with you, and out of that you found a profound point, or a much more meaningful point. Can you talk a little bit about how that story probably didn't occur to you immediately to be something profound, but as you pondered on it in the context of your customer service presentations, you realized, well, this could be something?
Doug, you make a good point. Originally, it was a small story, and the story grew as I was able to extract more meaning from it. Some stories are just so powerful that you immediately understand the message. Other stories we craft to extract the message. And of course, that requires that, first of all, we figure out what is the story teaching me, and secondarily, then, what can it teach my audience? I have been surprised over the years, and I'm sure you've had this experience, where you tell a story that you think is powerful and makes a good point, and someone will come up later and say, you know what I got out of that story? And they'll share something you hadn't even thought of. But if you're paying attention, that easily becomes part of what you can use as an illustration when you use the story again.
That actually stimulates the question for me. Did it evolve? Did that story change and evolve? Did the point ever change? Did the length of the story evolve into a much bigger story over time? Because now I know that you use that. You've got the book. Everything has evolved around it. Has it grown? Has it evolved?
Well, in some measure, it has evolved. The actual story has not changed. I've stayed very true to the facts of the story, and I have not needed to embellish or create dialogue or insert things that didn't happen. I'm not saying that that's necessarily wrong. Sometimes stories have to be tweaked a little bit to make them work. But in the case of the Fred factor, this is literally the way it happened. What obviously has evolved is I've taken an ongoing experience, because the story really was the beginning of a many-year relationship with Fred Shea. Fred is still a friend, and his wife and Darla and I and Fred get together periodically because of the attention it's brought to Fred. But what has changed is my ability to take these universal truths and to build on them. There are 4 principles that I talk about based on the Fred factor, and those 4 principles have evolved over the years. And although the story happened back in 1988, the book didn't come out in 2004, which I think illustrates a number of things, primary being that a good story is timeless. And a couple of things I've learned from reading some other authors lately is that a good story is not your story or my story, but our story. That's what makes a story powerful. Isn't that it happened to me or that it happened to you, but that the story is something that has happened to all of us. We've all had somebody like Fred. They didn't have the same name. They weren't a postal carrier. Or, even better, we've all had moments when we've been like Fred, when we've done something really extraordinary, and that's what resonates. Secondarily, what makes a story powerful, and I heard this from a guy named Rob Bell, is not that it happened, but that it happens. It keeps happening. In other words, when somebody hears the story of the Fred factor, they think about something happened to them last week. It's a different circumstance, but it's the same story. It's the story of an individual who has chosen to make a dramatically positive difference in their life. And so I think that as you think about your life and the things that happen and what you observe, you need to look for those universal truths that come out of the story that keep happening and that make the story a shared experience for both the speaker and the audience.
The Fred factor, the popularity of the book, tells me that you are branded by this story, that obviously it's something that became so powerful that you've built speeches around it, you've been hired for it, the book obviously propels more business for it. Is this a positive thing for you? Is this something that you're enjoying, the fact that the Fred factor lives on and brands you?
There's good news and bad news about a story or a particular content piece that you have as a speaker. The good news is, the upside I've enjoyed is the demand for the story, the demand for training, for products, for books, and I'm very grateful for that. But we've always been, when I say we, I mean myself and the people on my team here at Sanborn and Associates, we've always been very cognizant that you can become too narrowly positioned with a story. I have other things I like to talk about. My primary focus is leadership development. And while the marketplace sees the Fred factor as primarily an extraordinary service story, I see it as business philosophy, because the 4 principles that I talk about transcend simply customer service. And so I don't want to become pigeonholed as the Fred factor guy, because I know someday the book is going to fall from favor. I mean, all books do. You know, you hope they sell forever, but eventually the bloom is off the rose, and I don't want to be going, wow, I wish I wasn't so closely associated with the Fred factor, because now the bloom is off the demand for my speaking. I think the trick, and it's hard to do, is to do what people like John Maxwell and Ken Blanchard and Stephen Covey have done, and that is to brand themselves as content experts without becoming too singularly or closely identified with a particular book or story. I mean, we do know Ken Blanchard was the 1 Minute Manager author, but Ken's gone on to write in a lot of different areas in the management genre. John Maxwell, certainly known for his leadership work, but has written in many areas, attitude, relationships. So I think that's the key, is to use that brand or that position as a stepping stone to a more universal content brand that gives you a longer runway in your career.
When you're choosing or crafting a story, how do you determine the point of the story? Do you start out with the story and then add a point to it? Or do you start out knowing, I need to teach this point, I need to go on a story search, I need to look into my life or my experience for this story?
Well, Doug, I do it both ways. Sometimes I have a story and I say, is this story illustrative of some important points? Sometimes I have stories that you want them to work. You say, oh, this is such a cool story, and you realize it doesn't illustrate a cotton-picking thing, and short of using it as humor, it's worthless. Other times you have a story and you realize that there are some points that can be made, and maybe those points are different than what you thought the story was originally going to illustrate. On the other hand, there are times when I'm writing a book or developing a program where I will say, I need a powerful illustration of persuasion. And I'll then go back through my own memory banks as well as my files and other places to see if I can come up with some illustrations that work. So I think that there are two different tools that can both be used effectively.
Now, the next question has to do with memorization. Sometimes I have seen people tell a story. For instance, Tim Gard, I've seen him tell his story about the
Big sweaty guy.
Big sweaty guy. His story about the big sweaty guy. And I've seen Tim do this 4 or 5 times, and it is replicable. It is a piece of theater. He can do that over and over exactly the same. He can deliver on the promise of that's what you saw in the video, that's what you'll get. How do you feel about memorizing stories? Because I know your Fred factor at this point is probably pretty well memorized and replicable. Do you feel it's essential to memorize stories or only some stories?
My answer is a little bit different in that I think the best way to craft a story is by memorizing it, only that for me does not mean writing it out. For instance, my books have always been based on my verbal presentations and transcribed either from my head or from a tape. What I like to do, I talk to myself a lot. I craft stories by telling them over and over in my head or as I drive along, or in front of an audience. And the reason that I like especially to develop the story in front of an audience is that you can test different bits of timing and different placement to know where it most works. And so your premise is correct. The Fred Factor story is almost always the same basic story. But the nice thing is because it is memorized, I can inject things into the story specific to the audience, specific to what happened that morning in the hotel, specific to what I read in the newspaper last week, and not lose my train of thought. And in other words, I think that one of the benefits of having a very carefully scripted story, and I think you hit that point very well. It's theater because it isn't just the words. It's the timing. It's the tone of voice. It's the nonverbal. I think the benefit of having that memorized is it actually gives you more freedom to be spontaneous. I mean, that's one of those paradoxes. The more memorized you are, and the more comfortable you are with your material, the greater your ability to seize on things in the moment and incorporate them.
Yeah, I've found that it is a paradox for my students because I keep telling them the script shall set you free. Once you really know your script, you can insert, you can move things around, you can improvise based on the fact that you already have a strong foundation. So it's fun to hear you saying that as well, because so many people come to me and they're just, I resist memorizing. I'm better when I wing it.
Well, and here's the key, though. The way you know your script is when it doesn't look like you've got a script. I mean, there's another paradox.
Correct.
Is when the audience goes, that's so cool, and they realize, he's been telling that story for 15 years, but it's like he just told it for the first time. And that's the point of having the script.
Now, do you have any guidelines for how long you feel stories should be? What is an effective, for a signature story, for instance, not just a little vignette, an example that you just come up with at the last minute. What is a good length for a solid signature story?
Well, the principle I use for stories in general, I borrow from humor, and that is the longer the setup, the bigger the laugh you've got to get. And I think the same is true with the story. The longer the story, the bigger the point it's got to make. If you tell a long story and make a little point, it's imbalanced. A signature story is a little bit different because it kind of assumes that this is going to be a callback, something that you're going to be speaking to throughout the course of your presentation. Fred Factor probably started out to be a 3 or 4 minute story, went to 5 or 6. At 7 or 8 was way too long and is probably now back to a 4 or 5 minute story, again, depending on what I might pull in for that particular audience. But I think it's a little bit more intuitive, perhaps, than it is quantitative, in that you and your audience will sense when a story's taking too long. You get some nonverbal feedback feedback from your audience, or if you start to feel like it's labored, then that's a good clue that you should probably shorten the story.
What advice would you give to some of the listeners about storytelling in their keynotes, in their trainings, in terms of the critical importance of having some stories that you can refer back to, that can give you a little opportunity for comedy, drama, humor, that also can brand you in the long term?
Well, I think ultimately everything I do now is crafted around stories. I mean, I start with themes. I start with what my expertise is, which is leadership development. But I always think in terms of stories, because stories are the mental coat pegs that people hang your ideas on. And when I was younger, ironically, I can remember reading Norman Vincent Peale's books and saying to myself as a 13 or 14-year-old kid, wow, why does he tell so many stories? I just tell me what to do. Give me the how-tos and the wherefores. And it wasn't until later in life that I realized that that's where people were getting the value is we need as much, we need to know what it looks like when it's demonstrated in real life as we need to know what's the technique or the tactic or the strategy. And I think that as a business speaker still, primarily, that even if your stories are heavy on facts and figures and heavy on marketplace strategy, you can still engage the audience much more effectively and educate much more efficiently when you've got a compelling story to make your point.
Mark made a couple of great points about the importance of stories for a business speaker. The first one being that a good story is not my story or your story, but our story. It tells the tale of a universal and relatable experience. And when it's the right story, the lesson of the story is timeless. It continues to have meaning over time because the story speaks to what Mark calls a universal truth. So what is a universal truth? Good examples are honesty is the best policy. What goes around comes around. Do unto others. Lead by example. Seek first to understand and then to be understood. These are universal truths. Life principles that have been passed down from parent to child, from generation to generation, and from leader to leader. They're powerful lessons that apply to our personal and professional lives. I found that we can use stories for many purposes. They influence and inspire, they teach and illustrate, and they are very effective in sales and marketing. But when the opportunity arises for you to give a keynote speech or an important presentation, I believe your signature stories are the most effective when they illustrate broad principles, universal and timeless truths. When they do that, and do that brilliantly, they become, as Mark said, a shared experience for the speaker and the audience. And once again, as you've heard me say over and over, the best stories don't necessarily come from the most painful or transformational events. Sometimes they come from simply paying attention to what happens in our lives. In the case of Mark's Fred Factor story, Fred was Mark's mailman, a postal carrier. That's it. But because Fred did such an extraordinary and exceptional job of being a mailman, going above and beyond what anyone would expect of him, he became, in Mark's mind, a model of exemplary and extraordinary service. Now, Mark stated that the basic Fred story didn't change much over time. It expanded and contracted a bit as he worked out the kinks and crafted it into its final form, but the meaning got deeper. And that's the beauty of working with a story over time, of telling it again and again over time, of living with it, fussing with it, looking at it from different angles, and from being open to the lessons that your audience gets from it. Over time, your story, like a fine bottle of wine, matures. Because the true test of a great story is not simply that it teaches a lesson, but that it gives meaning to our lives. It provides context. It helps us understand our world and how we can make our lives and the lives of those around us better. As Mark said quite elegantly, stories are the mental coat pegs that people hang our ideas on. I really like that metaphor. Isn't that great? So I guess the question is, do you have a story that is so well crafted that they choose to hang your story on their mental coat peg. And what does it take to have a story that good, one that they want to take home with them? Well, first of all, it has to be the right story for the right moment in a presentation or keynote. It has to be placed correctly. So make sure that when you're choosing your story, you're not only choosing the story and thinking, well, I'll just use it, but you're also asking yourself, and where would this go? At the beginning of my speech, in the middle of my speech, at the end of my speech, where is the correct placement? Now, second, it has to be the right story to make the point that you want to make. You can't just shoehorn a point onto a story. The point has got to flow logically and effortlessly from the story. And number three, the story must be crafted. You can't just go out there and ad-lib a story and expect it to be brilliant. Not if you want to compete for space on that mental coat peg. And if you're a professional, not if you expect to compete in the marketplace against other professional speakers. It has to be crafted and polished, and as Mark mentioned, memorized. It's absolutely true that the script shall set you free. It will actually allow you to add little bits and pieces in the moment, relevant bits and pieces about the group you're speaking to or something that just happened in the room without compromising the integrity or flow of the story. It's one of those conundrums of life that the more structure you have, the more spontaneous you can be. As an example, I was just working with a speaker on one of her stories, and as I tried to coach her on it, she kept changing the story. Every time I asked her to redo a piece of the story, she kept adding new sentences and new information. It was very frustrating because it was clear that there was no script, no basic story to work from. And the point was unclear. She wasn't sure what she was using the story for, what she wanted it to do or to accomplish. Your story will never be great if every time you tell it, it's radically different. That's fine if you're telling stories at a party, but not in a business setting or as a professional speaker. If you want to be taken seriously in your job or considered a professional speaker, you need to master the craft of storytelling. Because as you've just heard with Mark, stories are an integral part of your overall branding strategy. They become part of your marketing and sales. And for the professional speaker, they're the video segments you put on your website. They might even become part of your logo. And for those of you working in a corporate or association setting, in a leadership capacity, or if you'd like to be in a leadership capacity, don't think of branding as something that your company does for you. You are always in the business of developing your own personal brand. It's called your professional image. What people think of when they think of you. And if you tell great stories, whether you know it or not, you're establishing one of the most important pieces of your personal brand impression, the excellent communicator brand. Think about it. Mark started out with a simple little story about his mailman, his postal carrier, and before long, it became obvious that his Fred story was an integral part of his business. The Fred story became the Fred Factor keynote, which morphed into the Fred Factor book, and now there are Friends of Fred discussion groups on social media. I'd like you to think of your best stories as children. As you live with them over time and share them with your audiences, they become part of who you are as a speaker or leader. Not only will you fall in love with them, so will your listeners. And as with children, your stories grow and mature and take on new and fascinating qualities. Some of your little stories will grow up and become big stories. But what happens when children grow up? Well, hopefully they leave home, and when they do, the parents have to let go. It's the same with some of your stories. As Mark mentioned, there's a danger in becoming too well known for any one particular story or idea. So, he's constantly on the lookout for the next Fred story, the new approach, the fresh idea. Remember, as leaders, as professional speakers, we're in the idea business. It's our job to lead the way, to be one step ahead of our audiences, to interpret what's going on in the world and give it meaning. So never become so attached to any of your stories that you fail to recognize when you've become bored or stale with a story. I'll admit to you that there was a time when I was using my streaking story in every presentation that I did, regardless of whether it fit the presentation or not. And one day I realized it had become a crutch. I was too dependent on it. But because I had developed my story theater method by that time, and I knew how to use it to craft any story, I was able to find new stories for the new programs I was developing, and that kept me fresh. So keep your eyes open and your imagination active. Pay attention to what's going on around you, and if something happens, a moment, something interesting that could become a story, immediately ask yourself, what's the point? What's the lesson here, and how could I use this in a speech or presentation? So remember, stories are the mental coat pegs that people hang our ideas on. So do you have a story that is so well crafted that they choose to hang your story on their mental coat peg? To learn more about Mark Sanborn and his books, training programs, keynote speeches, newsletters, and more, you can visit the website of Sanborn & Associates at www.marksanborn.com. That's MarkSanborn.com.
All right, well, that's it for this episode. If you feel that you learned something valuable today, something that you can use that will make your stories stick, stories that make you and your business memorable, marketable, and monetizable, there are 3 things I'd like you to do. First, click on the follow or subscribe button and leave a review wherever you listen. And second, share this podcast with your friends and coworkers, your email list, and on social media. And third, connect with me on LinkedIn. And when you're ready to get serious about taking your stories to the next level, or if you have an important speech, presentation, or TED Talk coming up, or if you want some guidance on how to make the transition to becoming a professional speaker, let's schedule your free 30-minute coaching session where we can get to know each other and see if we're a good fit. And as always, I'd love to hear from you with your questions and comments. Let me know that you're out there listening and learning. You can send an email with your questions, comments, and suggestions to Deborah@DougStevenson.com. That's Deborah, Deborah, @DougStevenson.com. Hey, thanks for listening. Until the next episode, I'm Doug Stevenson.